Thank you all for coming up to learn about one period of our history. I mean, there are 6 of these that we're going to be doing. This one is, oh, this is number 3, 3 of 6. So not all the questions will be answered today, but I know you're forming questions and you're thinking about the relevance of these things that happened in our past to today's issues. Pat is right. Good. But because the real beginnings of a lot of incredible revolutionary stuff for the state of Minnesota and our country too, I think, were here in our society, among members of our society. Today we're doing a special sequence. Madeline Chochi did her master's project on the history of the development of Planned Parenthood among the members of the First Unitarian Society. So she's going to start us off today and give you that history stretching from the beginning to the end, because it's pretty magnificent. And we do not want to abridge it. Are you going to mention the Channing room at the lying-in hospital? All right. Madeline Chochi. I present Madeline Chochi.
Right. Well, I am glad to go first because I am not the comedian that Wendy Jerome is, so we'll save the headliner for after me. So yeah, as Wendy said, a couple of years ago, I did a master's in social work, and as part of that, I dug into FUS's role in birth control in Minnesota, and ultimately the founding of the Planned Parenthood chapter here. There is so much that FUS has been involved in women's health and women's reproductive rights. And so that's kind of the story I'm going to tell today. I am not particularly a historian, but I kind of want to be after getting to dig through all these documents. Anyway, so let's start back in 1881, just to understand a little bit of the socio-political context, what's happening as FUS is getting founded. So we have the law of the land is the Comstock Act, which was named for Anthony Comstock. He was an anti-vice zealot in America, as well as a U.S. postal inspector. And he thought anything having to do with sex was obscene. And so he got him. And so he got this act named after him federally, banning anything obscene being mailed in the United States. And it defined pornography, birth control, and any information about birth control as obscene. So that's the law of the land. In Minnesota, it was illegal for doctors to discuss birth control with their patients. The women's suffrage movement, as we all know, was building, but women still were legally subordinate to their husbands, could not vote, could not own property, could not control their earnings, could not enter into contracts. So women had to find other ways to get stuff done. They had to build serious coalitions, all while they were wearing their 15 pounds of skirts and bustles and corsets. So FUS was a very, very early supporter of maternal health. By 1886, the Women and the Women's Alliance was already very active. They had a social relations committee, the purpose of which was to research into conditions of and propose solutions to the social problems of the world. So they were not aiming low, not from the get-go. These women were supporting the maternity hospital on Glenwood Avenue, even as Dr. Martha Ripley, yes, a woman, was founding Maternity Hospital. The FUS women banded together, they raised funds, they gathered furniture and supplies, and they outfitted the Channing room at the maternity hospital. Even before the hospital was up and running, this would be the first delivery room in the hospital, and it was specifically for poor and unmarried women to have a safe space for delivery and laying in for their recovery after birth. The FUS women supported the Channing Room at least until 1934, but I suspect until the end of the maternity hospital in 1956. Minutes show that they were giving annual donations of between $30 and $60 most of those years to keep the Channing Room going. In the first 11 years of the maternity hospital, not a single infant died during birth. Right? And I don't know the answer to that question. I imagine it's still in our archives for us to find out. But I do know that the mortality rate in general at the hospital remained much lower than the state's average for the entirety of the existence of the hospital. I love that the Alliance kept really boring minutes. They were also fabulously detailed. So from the minutes, I know that in 1910, Mrs. Hobart declined to serve another year as the maternity hospital committee chair, and that Mrs. Weeks was undecided about stepping up. Any of you have ever been on a committee for any social justice cause knows the stuff is hard work, and sometimes it's a grind just finding people to keep it going. And I found it sort of comforting to know that the women in 1910 were dealing with the same issues that we're dealing with still. Right. As an aside, these women were also leaning in on suffrage at the time. FUS's Mrs. Stockwell was head of the Minnesota Suffrage Association for 10 years, from 1901 to 1911, and Clara Euland was the last president of the Minnesota Suffrage Association, right before women got the right to vote, and the first president of the League of Women Voters, the Minnesota League of Women Voters, in 1919. All right, so back to birth control. We have the maternity hospital. Margaret Sanger had opened the country's first birth control clinic in New York in 1916, and birth control is becoming more and more discussed in the country. It's pretty available on the down low for married women and wealthy women. And the women of the FUS Alliance were aware that it was especially the poor and uneducated women who were essentially forced into having children annually, having too many children who they couldn't care for, often at the sacrifice of the women's health, primarily because they had no reliable means for preventing pregnancy. So an organization starts here in Minnesota called the Motherhood Protection League, about 1928. And its goal was to amend the state constitution to make it possible for physicians to give advice about birth control, because again, remember, they could not. So the Motherhood Protection League gets a letter in 29 from Margaret Sanger, who wants to speak here in Minneapolis. And she has not had an easy time of finding venues around the country that will allow her to speak. It's unclear to me who from the FUS Alliance may have been involved with that organization at the time, but it's clear that they were involved because Sanger's desire to speak becomes very known very quickly by John Dietrich. And so the Alliance in January 1930 reads, these are their minutes, Mr. Dietrich visited us as an embassy from the men's club. The club is to put on 2 lectures by Mrs. Margaret Sanger, one on the evening of March 18th and the other on the evening of one on the evening and one in the afternoon of March 18th. And the Alliance has been asked to sponsor the afternoon lecture. All the tickets for these 2 talks are sold out by March 4th, and a 3rd lecture just for women gets added to the program. Sanger's talks are announced in the FUS Order of Service on February 23rd. Again, this is 1930. And on that same Sunday, Dietrich gives a sermon called The Conspiracy of Silence about sex. And in it, he lamented that he and FUS were alone in their public support for openly discussing sexuality and sponsoring and promoting Sanger's visit. So this is Dietrich. And yet, among the masses of people, the conspiracy of silence still remains. For instance, we find few individuals and no organizations who are willing openly to help us in promoting Margaret Sanger's lectures. I never speak on the subject without receiving a volume of protests, and no other ministers have the courage to discuss it openly. Go, John. He went on. Almost every book with a sex reference has been banned in Boston. And just this last week, the Minneapolis Journal refused our usual church advertisement because of the subject of this address. So they wouldn't even advertise it. The Minneapolis Journal newspaper did have a little piece in the paper about Margaret Sanger's lectures. And apparently during her talk, she argued that doctors should have the right to talk with their patients about birth control. And she was really lobbying the doctors in her talk to join us, the advocates for birth control, the women who were doing this heavy lift. Join us, because really it's your right as doctors to have that right to talk to your patients. So she was working hard to get the doctors on board. So the next month, Dietrich gives another sermon, kind of bookending Sanger's visits. And this one was called The Ethics of Birth Control, in which Dietrich shares his reasons for supporting birth control. In it, you can hear how he essentially says, yeah, women need some help. But what we really need is birth control for eugenics, to breed a better class of people. And I know we did a talk, you and me, Mickey, talking about this a little bit. So he had a pretty social Darwinist perspective at the time. And this is Dietrich then in that talk. Contraception has long been practiced by well-informed people. And the present day agitation is merely in the interest of a general rather than a discriminating dissemination of contraceptive knowledge. And it's launched against certain obsolete legislation, which can be called in to prevent the spread of this information. The result is that the information is available to those who need it least and kept from those who are in dreadful need of it. And this is true not only from the standpoint of individual suffering, but what is perhaps more important from the standpoint of race improvement or deterioration. He goes on, while the movement today has many phases and is prescribed as the cure for many social ills, it was started solely to relieve the woman of the poorer classes from the tremendous suffering, which resulted from constant and unwanted pregnancy. Since then, a great many other problems have become involved. Most hazardous is the haphazard way in which the population increases. While our better stock is practicing birth control, we deny it to the great masses, which include the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, paupers, and the general mass of human wreckage. All of these defectives are on the increase, and this group is reproducing itself twice as fast as the normal family. It's generally conceded that something must be done. So he's on board. He has his own perspective on what's really important here. And Dietrich wasn't the only one at the time by a long shot promoting birth control and sterilization for eugenics, as well as to help women of the poorer classes. The Motherhood Protection League hosted men who led the state board of control, doctors from the university, the president of the Eugenics Society, all speaking to the value of birth control for eugenics. And what was interesting is that I could find no evidence that the women of FUS who were involved in the Alliance and the Motherhood Protection League held that view. Their purposes and their notes was always about the women's health and the children's health. But I suspect that they realized they needed these men, right? They needed to work with all the people in order to get their ultimate goal passed. So the minutes show that just after these talks, FUS members were hosting meetings of the Motherhood Protective League, and Jean Wilcox, a member here, was serving as secretary. And in the next year, 1931, they kicked it into high gear. They were leading a lobbying effort to gain rights for the doctors to share birth control. They were writing letters. They hosted a birth control booth at the National Conference of Social Work that was held here with the plea of, who can help us staff the booth? Right. And they changed the group's name that year, and it became the Minnesota Birth Control League, which was in line with the National Birth Control League that Margaret Sanger was leading. And then 4 months later, just 4 months later, the Minnesota Birth Control League, it's October now of 1931, and they asked the local welfare agencies to open a birth control clinic. And they're saying, we really need this. You need to help us out and open this clinic. And 201, the agencies declined. So, of course, the Birth Control League did it themselves. They raised the money and they opened it, one of the first birth control clinics in the country, as far as I could tell. The minutes of October 2nd say this, I love this. Mrs. Schaefer read the list of people who had consented to serve on our advisory board. She announced the renting of offices at the 223 Walker Building, which is just down on the corner of Hennepin and 8th Avenue downtown, where now the Capitol Grill is. The building still stands. It's the second floor there. So they rented that as a space for the clinic as soon as we can undertake it. Office hours were announced from 3 to 5 p.m. on Thursdays, and an appeal was made for donations to furnish the office and the clinic. So that's October 2nd. October 6th, the FUS Alliance notes in its minutes, it was decided that there should be in the press only notices of our general meetings. The list of people on the advisory board was not to be published, and no announcement of the opening of the clinic. It makes me think about the training. The clinic opened 3 weeks later. So they go from the beginning of October to the end of October and open a birth control clinic. These were some badass women. So the story continues on. That was 1931. 1940, that clinic eventually becomes the Minnesota chapter of Planned Parenthood. So doing birth control education. And our involvement, of course, has continued on and on since then. Many of you will remember Bob McCoy, longtime FUS member who died in 2010. He ran an underground abortion referral service in the 1960s leading up to Roe versus Wade, helping women to locate and obtain safe abortions, often housing them in his home and ultimately seeing their safe transport to other states or Canada or Mexico. And when Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, Bob became the director of Minnesota's first legal abortion clinic, the Meadowbrook Women's Clinic in St. Louis Park, which continues on today as Whole Women's Health. How cool is that? We also have the FUS member, Peter Discoli. I don't know, is Peter in the room? He's out of town, okay. Peter Discoli is another hero of this work. He served as a doctor providing abortion care and other care to women at Whole Women's Health and at Planned Parenthood for many, many years, bringing a suit as medical director of Planned Parenthood at one point against the state of South Dakota for their restrictive abortion laws in the early 2000s. We have Mickey Morissette, who's been an advocate for single mothers by choice for decades, an idea which clearly was not on the radar during the early days. Unmarried people should not get birth control and could not legally until 1972, I think. And of course, more recently in 2019, under the leadership of David Breeden and Jim Fody, and especially Kelly Clement, FUS joined as a plaintiff in a lawsuit to challenge 13 Minnesota laws that were putting undue burden and restriction on those seeking abortion in Minnesota. So the congregation ultimately stepped away from that lawsuit because there was a question of whether as a religious organization we had standing, but it does not take away from FUS's willingness to take a strong public stance on the issue. And the lawsuit, as we all know, was decided finally in June 2024, and we won. And those restrictive laws cannot be enforced in Minnesota any longer. So a final twist on the history, the Comstock Act. Remember our friend Anthony at Comstock? Yeah, that law is still on the books. It has been weakened over the years, but it is still being used today by anti-abortion advocates who are trying to argue that abortion medications, mifepristone, and other supplies for abortion care cannot be mailed. However, right now in play, courtesy of Senator Tina Smith, there is a Stop Comstock Act. A Stop Comstock Act bill to stop the Comstock Act from being used. So if you want to continue our long and illustrious history in this topic, you can pick up the phone and call your representative or the senators and let them know that you are strongly supporting that. I just want to thank Mrs. Hobart, Mrs. Weeks, Mrs. Stockwell, Mrs. Wixon, Mrs. Euland, and all of you that cleared the way for the rest of us to come later and pick up that fight, which we still do. So thanks for sharing this time with me today. And if there's time, I know I went a little long.
Okay. How do you all feel about a few questions to Madeline? Then I'm going to give you another little political thing.
And then you've got, yeah, the rest of your story from this morning.
Yeah, use the microphone. So people can't hear. All right. Anybody game for a question?
Just talking to it.
Hello. Anyone with a good question? Does anyone have a question for Madeline?
Or comment or reaction.
Or comment or reaction? Rick does, Bob does. Bob's closer.
Well, actually, I didn't. I just happened to raise my hand to itch my face, but it was a splendid presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
And Rick?
Just a comment. Peter Discoli, he worked for Minnesota Planned Parenthood, I think Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
And when he went to work, he wore a bulletproof vest.
I believe that.
A bulletproof vest.
And still today, you can find him listed on the abortiondocs.com website that lists abortion doctors and their home addresses.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Peter also flew to Montana on a regular basis until he retired so that they could have care there. So just a question. Sorry to put you on the spot if you don't know the answer to this, but did
I'll
you
just make it up.
okay, did you track whether John Dietrich softened his thoughts about the eugenics over time, or did it drop off as a conversation?
You know, it largely seems to have dropped off. It dropped off significantly. It changed, I think, because, in 1930, what's happening in Europe, right? So as the intentions of Germany, of Hitler, become clearer and are covered in the papers, eugenics falls off as an idea here significantly. People are like, that's not what we meant, right? And they realized that there was danger behind those ideas, I think. It was interesting because then in World War II, I can't get into all of it, but the Planned Parenthood information, then the way it's marketed, is really about sort of helping the country by having healthy children, that we need healthy children, we need healthy soldiers. And so it gets tweaked a little.
I just wanted to make a couple comments following up on the eugenics issue, which is that the UUA is very aware of and has published many articles, and there are many papers written about Unitarian and Unitarian Universalists' involvement in eugenics. And if you can Google it and read papers and read statements, and not unlike our involvement in residential schools, our involvement in settler colonialism and slavery,
Right,
the things we learn, we correct, but it's so important that we own that we had a role in that.
Yes, exactly. And I certainly didn't quote that to make Dietrich look bad. That was, yeah, not my intent at all. But really that it just highlighted for me that there are always so many perspectives on these issues. You know, good people all leaning the same direction still have differences of opinion about why we're doing what we're doing and, you know, and what's the purpose. And so that for me was so much the takeaway. That the women were looking out for women's health and children's health, and we had to have a conversation about how are we going to do that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
I'm going to fill you in a little on the back of the society, what we're managing, and it doesn't squish into the 1936 to 1951 period because we can't get everything in there. So at next time, I think you're going to hear more about religious education. It was running strong from the beginning. I can just assure you of that. And we do know one name that'll be familiar to you. Frank Rarig taught in the Sunday school, and he was very active in our congregation. He was also the chair of our board from 1938 to 1946. We always were musical from the beginning. And we could not find very many photographs from this period. I think during the 36 to 51 is the day of the professional photographer because people couldn't afford cameras. That was not something people. So we don't have many photographs, but we did have the photographs of the choir to show you and the choir's sense of humor. The part that is, dark and troubling for us was the whole issue of, are we going to get a new building? Because we were in a residential house after they had to sell the beautiful Red Sioux quartzite monument at 8th Street and St. Mary Place. And they squashed into a little house on Loring Park. And they called it the Unitarian Center. Now, keep in mind that even at this time, they had 1,000 people coming to hear John Dietrich. So they had to, on Sundays, rent theaters downtown. But they would have meetings at the Unitarian Center, and the kids would kind of sit on top of each other's heads over there in the little house. It was a pretty desperate situation. The Depression hit. That released a whole lot of people who couldn't afford gas to drive into the city on the weekends to come and hear John Dietrich. We always did have around 400 to 500 members, however. The crash meant that our attendance dropped to 637 adults. But we still had such an active congregation. We had competitive elections for the board and for the Ways and Means Committee. I mean, can you believe this? It was, we were a big bunch, and I guess chatty. The Thorpe brothers, realtors who bought our building, could not afford to pay us, so we lost that hunk of money. John Dietrich, bless him, asked to have his salary reduced from $10,000 to $6,000. And we established we would bring books and magazines in every Sunday and swap books and magazines because people didn't have the money to buy things. The Humanist Credit Union helped a lot of families. Carl Lewis was one of the people who started the Humanist Credit Union. There were a group of physicians at the University of Minnesota who in this congregation decided, medical care is ruining families. People can't afford it. There has to be a better way. How about medical co-ops? So they started the whole study, which eventually evolved into Health Partners, which we have today. So think about the things we've started here. Madeline's just mentioned to you Planned Parenthood, Health Partners, and what became the Minnesota Memorial Society, the Funeral Consumers Alliance. We think. Oh, wow. Pillsbury United Communities, Madeline is telling me. Wow. Okay, this is great. So John Dietrich, great speaker, realizes that he does not have the skill to do administration. He brings on Ray Bragg. Ray Bragg had been, now, you know the New Yorker cartoon that, looking west from New York, there's New York City in detail, but you look west from New York and there's like nothing out there. The Unitarian Association, sort of like to take care of everything west of Chicago, had something called the Western Conference. And Ray Bragg was the head of that. He was truly a terrific administrator. And Ray Bragg did go on after the war to be the person who set up the Unitarian Service Committee in Europe after the Second World War. So Ray Bragg came on, and both Ray and John could see we were just going to fizzle out unless we got a building. And they were really pumped up. We've got to buy land and we got to build. Around in about 1936 or so, the board appointed a search committee to look for land. And the land that they found is this third lot off of Hennepin on Mount Curve. Okay. Unfortunately, it is land that was owned by a family called the Partridges. And early on, there had been a member of the congregation whose last name was Partridge. So that raised some feathers. People thought, ooh, inside job. They also were upset because it was too far away from Minneapolis. The one issue they didn't raise was there's no parking, which has always remained with us. So when the search committee came back and said, we found this land, we really ought to jump on it. It's offered for $15,200. Let's get it. Ray and John really wanted us to buy this land. And they could see there was rumblings of a few people who didn't like the idea. In fact, Mercedes Nelson, who is, some of you may even know her name, she paid for one of our pulpits. Mercedes Nelson said, we should have a second search committee. Things were getting rumbly. The board said, okay, those of you who are raising an issue, we're going to have a special meeting for you guys, and we're going to talk to you. We want to listen to you. They sent out invitations to these people, and these people did not show up. I should mention the head of the people who were very critical was a fellow named Mr. Dollenmeyer, and he was a great guy. Mr. Dollenmeyer and Mrs. Dollenmeyer's names are all over our archives for like teaching, doing committee work, tireless stuff. But here he is, Mr. Dollenmeyer and 13 others decided we cannot go ahead with this land. So when at the annual meeting in 1938, the meeting opened and if I get the dates, I mean, it's like this happens by 2-week intervals. The Ray and John go out. They know not everybody's going to come to the annual meeting because nobody's going to squish into that little space. So they've collected 440 proxy votes to present at the meeting to make sure that we push ahead and buy this land. And as the meeting opens, the 14 members who've heard about this have just had delivered to the members of the board and Carl Lewis, who is opening the meeting and one of the people who really knows we have to get this land. They're opening their letters that say you're being sued. Carl Lewis has a heart attack and falls dead at the beginning of the meeting in front of everybody. And the meeting is adjourned because that's the polite thing to do on these horrible occasions. They meet 2 weeks later. And we do finally decide to buy the land. It was a vote of 171 to 38 to buy the land. So we go ahead. Still, the Depression is upon us, and it takes us a long time to get up the energy. We have to borrow $10,000 from the Unitarian Association. And we don't even dream of being able to build for quite a while. When we do choose architects, their architect, Roy Thorshoff, was one of the leaders in the congregation. And it's his firm of Long and Thorshoff that are tasked in 1945 with sketching some plans for us on this piece of land that's way too far out of Minneapolis. okay, it's 1947. Oh, yes, I should not forget this. Carl Lewis's death, the consternation of the congregation. This is when John Dietrich decides it's time for him to resign, which probably saved his health. So he resigns a week later after this whole incident. We push ahead and start working on plans for the building. And we also had our board, bless them, have decided to find out if they can find another minister because we're ministerless in there without Ray Bragg. And they have found a fellow named Carl Storm. And you're going to hear about Carl Storm at our next history smash. Thank goodness there wasn't too long a period in there when we were leaderless. A frightening period. And I'm also willing to hear any questions that you may have. It is impressive to me how much these people were doing during the Depression and really pushing ahead with, even though they were having trouble their own selves. Questions, thoughts? Wendy.
Hello, thank you. I've heard about radio broadcasts of John Dietrich's talks, and I'm wondering if that's when people couldn't afford to drive in because of gasoline prices and the membership dropped and so on. Is that when we picked up on radio broadcasts?
We started his radio broadcasts. We did those from 1924 to 1934 on WDGY. And I think we left them off because why did we stop doing it? I'm not sure why we discontinued that. Maybe WDGY thought we were too radical. I'm not sure. Or maybe we couldn't afford to be on there. We had to cut. That's a good question though, Wendy. Bob, did you have a question? You were scratching, aren't you?
Yeah, I was just scratching my nose this time. But no, I was curious about Frank Rehrig and Carl Lewis. Can you tell us a little bit more about them? I know Frank Rehrig apparently was a professor at the university or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, and it would be good to do some research on Frank Rehrig. Yeah, I think he was he in drama? Yeah. And he did, as a Sunday school teacher, he was really into teaching science to the kids, and he was great. He was quite an energetic fellow. I wish I knew more. The other fellow you mentioned, I had not.
Well, you said the guy. Carl Lewis.
Oh, Carl Lewis.
The guy who dropped.
It would be good to find out more about Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis started the Humanist Credit Union, and he was on any number of other committees. He was very devoted to the congregation, as was Mr. Dolenmeyer and Mrs. Dolenmeyer. It's kind of horrible. It would be nice to do an in-depth on him. I mean, he deserves it, Thank you. Good. That's a very good question.
There's one behind you.
What happened to the Humanist Credit Union?
Good question. I haven't found anything on it since its founding. And that would be a good thing to dig into. Yeah. Darn, we could bring that back.
All right. And then I think somebody here had a question, and then I see a hand up here.
What seems to have been the secret that kept the energy going during these very difficult times? Because the whole country was in great difficulty during the war. And there was a driving force that kept it going. Do you have any idea what that was?
Pat, that is an excellent question. And I am sure that Reverend Yulin could address it in a sermon or 4 or 5. I don't know what keeps people going in the face of awful. Yes.
Okay, this isn't so much of a question, but part of the reason that we're doing these history smashes is to have you reflect on the time. So that was an excellent question, I think. What keeps people going in this awful, awful time? And, obviously Tina Smith is now that she's decided to resign, is really outspoken about things that are going on. But I think that as you leave today, I want you to think a little bit about how this all is coming together again. And we're still facing some of the same comments and criticisms. Birth control, oh, families, oh.
Yeah.
So just a quick personal connection. When we first moved here in 1975, my spouse was in a graduate program and I was looking for a job. And I fetched up at the architectural firm of, at that time it was called Thorson and Thorshoff Associates, which was Roy Thorshov's architectural firm. And I was in the back room running the print machine and taking out the mail. And we were in a building downtown that's now the site of what used to be called the Pillsbury Center, that big double limestone high-rise. So without knowing any of this history and without having any particular connection to Minneapolis, that was just a kind of a fortuitous moment in time. So I got to know Roy because he would come into the office 2 or 3 days a week. He was elderly in those days and would sit in his office. And he ran something called the Torskekklubben, which was his Norwegian friends. And they would get together once a month and have dinner and trade stories or whatever. But I would do the mailings for his meetings. So,
Did he ever lure you over to FUS?
no, but many years ago we did find the trove of drawings that were done, which I think are still available somewhere. They got preserved, I think, in a scan form, and I'm not sure where those records are, but.
Yeah. There's one in the back. Yeah, one question.
Did somebody else? Oh. We come around here.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, I know this is primarily focused on us, obviously, but there were other Unitarian and Universalists in the area, I assume. I don't know when the other organization started. I know this was well before the merger, but have you any information about like what collaboration we did with these other now associated organizations?
Yes, early on, it was somebody at the St. Paul Unitarian group who fished out Henry Martin Simmons and suggested that this young minister from Alton, Illinois, come up here. So we owe that to the St. Paul Unitarians. There was, in fact, a Norwegian Unitarian church in town, which attracted, the services were in Norwegian, with a Norwegian-speaking minister, Christopher Jansen, and it flourished for quite a while until Christopher Jansen went back to Norway, and then they didn't have a riveting speaker, and they kind of folded. But all of the wonderful thing about, I kind of looked for class issues among us, and certainly we had wealthy people that got the FUS started, but the Norwegians were they were tradespeople. And they joined us. I think a healthy mix came in with some of these Norwegians who they lost the Unitarian Church. And basically those two, the St. Paul Unitarians and the Minneapolis Unitarians, were the group here. And Unitarianism spread into the 12 little congregations that we have in the Twin Cities area now after the 70s, I believe. That is a great question. Online question. Oh my gosh.
Go ahead. Oh, you know this.
That's okay, thank you. So Fred Olson asked about the lawsuit, like what happened with it, how it continued, and I know you said it went to the Minnesota Supreme Court, but what can you tell about that?
Yes, the lawsuit I should take. The 14 people who were suing us, this lawsuit went to the Minnesota Supreme Court and it was discussed there. Its resolution was this, that Minnesota state doesn't allow proxy voting. We don't do proxy voting in Minnesota. Our bylaws didn't either. But Minnesota doesn't do proxy voting.
about everything. And the Unity Settlement House was in St. Paul, as I understand it. And then they eventually, maybe Pat knows, but they did, it is now no longer there, but the money for that came from First Universalists for a very, very long time. They were very supportive of it. We worked with them in the late 80s with summer programs for our kids. So.
Audrey.
I'm just not so much of the social issues. I'm just trying to track the buildings that we were in. So I know there was a fire in a building, but I think that was older. But you mentioned going forward that they sold some building to the Thorpes or something. What was the building that they sold and then lost the money, and then we were buildingless, and then we bought a house? So I'm just really confused about like where we were.
Building stories are confusing, but very enlightening. We even before we got a building, the beautiful building at 8th Street and St. Mary's Place, what is there now? It's LaSalle and 8th Street, where the Dayton's Air Door used to be. It was a big, beautiful building. It was such a monumental building, so well designed that it was the only building west of the Mississippi that was featured in the Baedeker's guide that Europeans would bring to tour in North America. It was a gorgeous thing. We lost that building because the street was being widened, and it would have been just like pushing against our granite. We had, even before that was being built and after, this happened twice, where we would have a fire or something in our building, and what the congregation that is now Temple Israel would take us in. We met. They had a different name, Shari Tov, and they took us in. Then they had a fire and we took them in. And this happened twice. So we have this tight old relationship with Temple Israel. This is not the only town where I have seen that. This happened in the Unitarian Church in Toledo, Ohio. There was a fire and the Jews took in the Unitarians. And then there was a fire and the Unitarians took in the Jews. Interesting to think on. The building we were in after we lost the Unitarian Center was a house at 1526 Harmon Place, now destroyed. It would be a little bit behind where the Ole Bull statue is, so it was replaced by MCTC. Torn out. It was not big, and it had a ballroom though, on the 3rd floor, so they could squeeze people in there. We really needed a new space. That was the one at 8th Street and LaSalle. Thorpe Brothers could not afford to pay us for it. They bought it, and they were going to, I don't know what they were going to do with it, but they could not afford to pay us. So should we go after them today, do you think?
I just want to make a couple of comments. The first is back to the Norwegians. This is very much an aside, but I just want to say that Unitarians and Universalists came to this continent in very different ways. And the U.S. version of Unitarianism is quite different, actually, from its inception and then growth, than Unitarianism coming from other places in Europe. So I assume, I don't know for sure, but that this Unitarian church came from people immigrating from Norway who were already Unitarians in Norway. Similar situation outside of Winnipeg, that there was a church there that was Icelandic, and the historical church still exists outside of Winnipeg. And they did services in Icelandic. So anyway, just a little aside about that. And it's great that they could meld, because there's kind of issues that, like we have a very different kind of Unitarianism than the folks in Romania have today and Transylvania. So it's great. And I also just want to reiterate Adele's question by saying, or comment saying that DNA exists in a social DNA exists in a congregation that sometimes is hard to track. Like, why do we do it that way? Or why do I make that gesture? Or why do we say things that way that are passed on in families? The same thing happens in communities. And so looking at our history is a wonderful way to think, well, why do we do that way? What do we do when people have a fight here? You know, what do we do when people leave the congregation? What do we do when we don't have enough money for what we need to do? And you look at history and you say, oh, look how we did it before. Maybe we're repeating that pattern. So just food for thought. And I know it's 1:15, but Kathleen hasn't said this.
Edvard Grieg was a Unitarian in Norway.
What I wanted to ask about is what happened to the church on Harmon Place.
It was knocked down. Yeah, it was knocked down, and that's where MCTC is. It was a house. It was called. Yeah.
I thought it was a building.
No, there was a building at 8th Street and LaSalle, and that was knocked down.
Oh, okay.
That was the really fancy one.
When was the Harmon Place location part of where people went? Was that in 1950? At least 1950?
The house might have still. The house was there in 1951 when we moved out of it.
Okay.
But it is
here.
Yes, but
Did they say that this location was too far away from Minneapolis?
Yes, it's way outside the city.
But this was part of Minneapolis at the time, though, wasn't it?
Well, you know, I'm with you on this one.
So how long did it take them after they bought this land to build the building?
It took them, let's see, Long and Thorshaw got to work in 1945, and we moved into the building in 1951. The land was bought in 1938.
Wow. So quite some time.
Yes, yeah. This is it. Yeah. This is the one that cost Carl Lewis his life.
All right. Are we still going? Cynthia?
No, we don't.
As another aside to the eugenics issue, for a brief time, there was a plank in the suffragette movement that women should be able to know the medical history of their prospective husband's family. And there was an author by the name of Mary Austin, who was part of Jack London's writing community, who was a real proponent of that because she had married a man whose family had children born with intellectual disabilities. So she was angry. So fast forward to today, you're dating someone, things heat up. Do you want to know his DNA before you answer yes to marry? I mean, think about it. It's a choice issue. And is anyone surprised it hasn't come up yet publicly? Especially if you come from a community that believes that there is a divine intervention in terms of how you partner.
We're going to keep going?
It's becoming 1:20, so this should be maybe. Would you like to be honored as our last question? Okay.
Hand up too. Quick comment and then last question, and then we'll wrap it up, okay?
With hope in mind and thinking of the League of Women Voters, wouldn't it be great if they were now again running the presidential debates?
Yes.
Yes, I could get behind that.
And I was wondering, has FUS ever had a relationship with the Dakota people of Minneapolis and those who stewarded the land before this was here?
You know, the Dakota, yeah, I think that's only been recently. And that is a wonderful question. Now, what is the Dakota 38? Describe that program, if you can, Jenna. We'll hand Jenna the mic. She's the last answer. Mother.
well, and I don't know the full answer, but Shelley Schreffler connected with people in the Native American community, and this congregation for maybe 15 years helped put on the meal when the Dakota 38 horse riders arrived in Mankato on December 26th in commemoration of the time when the Dakota 38 were hung in Mankato. So I remember when someone from that organization came and gave our congregation a huge quilt that was hung in the front of the sanctuary in commemoration of our work with that meal.
Yeah, where's that quilt? Yeah, right. Hey, we got to get on that quilt. Okay. Thank you very much for your intelligent questions and thinking. And if we've missed other questions, catch some of us on the transition team, or me. I'm on that team too. Adele is, I am, Cindy is, George is, Justice Bobby is, and the Dreyers, Amy and Hoyt Dreyer, are on that committee. So we'd love to, we're just promoting thinking, which is not hard to do around here. The next one is going to be April 27th, the exciting years of Carl Storm. And Carl Storm used to tell the best puns in his sermons. There you go.